Frederick the Great once said that the secret of war lies not in bold strokes, but in careful logistics. He could have been talking about the spice trade. Everyone wants a dramatic story, a lone genius, a hidden empire, a colonial conspiracy to bury the truth. And yeah, the internet delivers exactly that kind of content about ancient Filipino merchants. Bold claims, wild maps, zero footnotes. I'm going to tell you something less exciting, but far more useful. The real story of Filipino involvement in maritime trade across Asia doesn't need exaggeration. The documented, archaeological, peer-reviewed truth is impressive enough. It also looks nothing like the clickbait version. Let's start with the problem. The popular narrative says ancient Filipino merchants controlled India's spice trade. That framing collapses under any scrutiny. Control implies monopoly. It implies political dominance over supply chains, pricing, distribution networks. The Austronesian-speaking peoples of the Philippine archipelago were remarkable seafarers. Nobody serious disputes that. But controlling India's spice trade requires evidence that doesn't exist, not because the British destroyed it, because the claim itself misunderstands how pre-colonial Asian commerce actually worked. Here's what we do know. Filipinos sailed. Far, the Austronesian expansion, beginning roughly 3000 to 1500 BCE, produced the greatest maritime diaspora in pre-modern history. Outrigger canoes, sophisticated celestial navigation, knowledge of monsoon wind patterns passed down through oral tradition over centuries. Truly centuries. These weren't accidental drifters. They were systematic navigators who reached Madagascar off the coast of Africa. That's a staggering achievement confirmed by linguistic and genetic evidence. The Butuan archaeological sites in Mindanao yielded balangay boats dating to around the 4th century CE, carbon dated. Real. These were sewn plank vessels capable of open ocean voyaging. The Philippine National Museum has fragments. You can look them up. Trade goods found alongside them include Chinese ceramics, glass beads likely originating from South or Southeast Asia, and gold artifacts showing contact with multiple trading networks. Stop. Now here's where the story gets complicated and where most content creators lose the plot entirely. Trade participation is not trade control. Filipino merchants were nodes in a vast decentralized network. The maritime trade routes connecting China, Southeast Asia, India, and the Arab world didn't have a single controlling power for most of their history. They operated more like a mesh network than a highway system. Multiple players, overlapping routes, seasonal patterns dictated by monsoons. Filipino traders moved goods between islands and into broader Southeast Asian circuits. Some of those goods eventually reached Indian ports. That's documented. But the journey from participated in regional trade to controlled India's spice trade requires about 47 leaps of logic with no landing pads. The spices themselves tell an important part of this story. Cloves came from the Maluku Islands. Pepper grew abundantly in southern India. Cinnamon originated in Sri Lanka and southern China. Nutmeg came from the Banda Islands. Filipino merchants had geographic proximity to some of these sources and served as intermediaries. The Sulu Zone, connecting the southern Philippines to Borneo and the Maluku Islands, was a genuine commercial corridor. William Henry Scott's work on pre-colonial Philippine societies documents these connections carefully. He used Spanish colonial sources, Chinese dynastic records, and archaeological evidence. Boring methodology. Reliable results. Think about it. The Laguna copperplate inscription from 900 CE gives us hard evidence of something critical. It mentions debts, place names, and social titles reflecting Indian cultural influence. Sanskrit loanwords appear throughout Philippine languages. Gold artifacts from Surigao Eco-Hindu-Buddhist iconographic traditions. These connections prove sustained cultural and commercial contact with Indianized kingdoms in Southeast Asia. 𝘍𝙬𝙘𝙤. The Chola dynasty's maritime reach, Filipino polities interacted with all of them. But interaction through intermediary networks differs fundamentally from direct control over Indian commerce. And that distinction matters more than you might think at first glance, because the boring truth reveals something genuinely fascinating about how pre-colonial Filipino societies operated. They didn't need to control anything to thrive. The barangay system, small kinship-based political units led by datas, was perfectly adapted to distributed trade networks. Each coastal settlement functioned as an independent commercial node. Flexibility over centralization, adaptation over domination. That's not a weakness. It's a strategy that sustained maritime communities for over 1,000 years. Look, the next problem surfaces when we bring Britain into the narrative. The claim that Britain covered up this Filipino trading empire has a seductive logic. Colonial powers did suppress indigenous histories. That's true globally. The Spanish burned texts and disrupted oral traditions in the Philippines for over 3 centuries. British colonial historiography centered European agency and minimized Asian maritime achievements. All documented, all real. But there's a massive difference between systemic Eurocentric bias in historical scholarship and a deliberate conspiracy to hide a specific Filipino empire. British colonial interest in the Philippines was minimal compared to their obsession with India and the Malay Peninsula. They occupied Manila briefly during the 7 Years' War from 1762 to 1764. That's it. Their primary rival in the region was Spain, then the Dutch. The idea that Britain specifically targeted Filipino trading history for destruction assumes a level of concern that doesn't match the archival record. They were busy extracting wealth from Bengal. Filipino merchants weren't on their radar. Now. Well, what did happen, and this part deserves genuine attention, involves the broader erasure of Southeast Asian agency in global trade narratives. European historians from the 18th through mid-20th century consistently portrayed Asian trade as passive. They described Asian societies as waiting for European ships to arrive and impose order on chaotic local markets. That framing was wrong, demonstrably, provably wrong. Scholars like Anthony Reid, Kenneth Hall, and Pierre-Yves Manguin spent decades dismantling it using Asian primary sources. Chinese records from the Song dynasty describe Filipino traders arriving at Guangzhou with trade goods. The Zhufanji, written by 𝘍𝙬𝙘𝙀 around 1225, describes the products and peoples of Ma'ai, generally identified as Mindoro, or the broader Philippine archipelago, beeswax, cotton. Abaca textiles. These aren't the trade profiles of passive recipients. They're the inventories of active commercial participants. But the correction of Eurocentric bias doesn't require inventing a Filipino monopoly over Indian spice routes. That's replacing one distortion with another, and it actually undermines the credibility of legitimate pre-colonial Philippine historiography. Let me show you what systematic, unglamorous research actually reveals when nobody's trying to make a viral headline. The work of Laura Lee Junker on Philippine chiefdom-level trade provides detailed analysis of how prestige goods circulated through inter-island networks. Chinese porcelain fragments found in Philippine burial sites and habitation areas demonstrate centuries of sustained trade contact. The distribution patterns show that coastal datas controlled access to foreign goods and used them to maintain political authority. This wasn't romantic, it was calculated political economy. A datu who monopolized trade access at a river mouth could dominate surrounding communities through gift-giving and redistribution. Cold, methodical, effective. The gold of Butuan deserves specific mention. Recovered artifacts include chains, pendants, and ornaments weighing collectively several kilograms. Their craftsmanship shows techniques paralleling traditions from Java and mainland Southeast Asia. Some pieces display iconography linked to Hindu-Buddhist traditions, confirming the cultural flow along trade routes. Were these produced locally or imported? The evidence suggests both. Filipino goldsmiths adapted foreign styles to local tastes. That's not cultural passivity, that's creative engagement with a continental commercial system. Here's where the thread connects to something the viral claims accidentally stumble near. Filipino trading communities did establish diasporic presences at foreign ports. Chinese sources mention Filipino traders in southern Chinese cities. The Sulu Sultanate, established around the 14th or 15th century, maintained diplomatic and commercial relationships extending to China and Borneo. Maranao and Tausug traders operated across the Sulu and Celebes seas. These activities placed Filipino merchants within striking distance of the westward spice routes. But proximity to a highway doesn't mean you own the highway. They used it, they profited from it. Segments of it ran through their waters, and the tolls they extracted from passing trade were a real source of wealth and power. Important. The system worked because it was boring. Regular monsoon cycles, predictable sailing seasons, established anchorages, trusted trading partners maintained across generations. A Datu's son married a trader's daughter at a port 3 islands away. Kinship networks became commercial networks, became political alliances. No genius required, no grand strategy. Repetition, reliability, reciprocity. These 3 unglamorous principles built and sustained maritime Southeast Asian trade for centuries before any European ship rounded the Cape of Good Hope. And when the Portuguese showed up in 1521 with Magellan, what did they find? Not a primitive backwater. They encountered organized polities with established trade protocols, hierarchical social structures, and leaders who negotiated from positions of genuine strength. Lapu-Lapu didn't defeat Magellan because of some mystical warrior spirit. The defense of Mactan succeeded because a local leader made a tactical assessment and committed resources accordingly. Process over inspiration. Moving on. The Spanish colonial period disrupted these networks catastrophically. Forced relocation, tribute extraction. The galleon trade redirected commercial flows through Manila toward Acapulco, cutting out traditional inter-island and regional trade circuits. This destruction of pre-colonial commercial systems was devastating and real. It doesn't need fictional enhancement. Hang on. Moving on. The deeper question underneath all of this matters more than any single historical claim. Why do people want the exaggerated version? Why does Filipino merchants participated actively in regional Southeast Asian trade networks that connected indirectly to Indian Ocean commerce feel insufficient? The answer involves identity and colonial trauma and the very human desire to counter centuries of belittlement with something grand. That impulse makes emotional sense, but building cultural pride on unverifiable claims creates a fragile foundation. The documented history provides a much stronger one. Filipino maritime achievement is genuinely extraordinary without embellishment. Crossing thousands of kilometers of open ocean using star navigation and wave-reading techniques requires accumulated knowledge refined across dozens of generations. Building ocean-going vessels from tropical hardwoods using dowels and fiber lashing, no iron nails, demands engineering sophistication that European shipbuilders of the same period couldn't replicate. Maintaining trade relationships across linguistic and cultural boundaries for centuries requires diplomatic skill and institutional memory. That's the real empire, not one drawn on maps with borders and armies. An empire of knowledge, technique, and relationship, invisible to colonial observers who only recognized power when it looked like their own. The British didn't cover it up because they didn't understand it. Their categories couldn't contain it. And that brings us back to Frederick the Great and his point about logistics. The ancient Filipino maritime world didn't produce famous conquerors or build stone monuments that tourists photograph. It produced something harder to see and arguably more impressive: a distributed commercial system that sustained millions of people across thousands of islands for over a millennium. No central bureaucracy, no standing navy, no written legal codes that survived, networks of trust and seasonal rhythm and accumulated skill. The secret was never a secret. It was procedure. It was showing up at the same anchorage when the southwest monsoon shifted. It was carrying the right goods for the right market at the right time. It was training your children to read the stars the same way your grandparents taught you: systematic, persistent, unromantic, real. That kind of empire doesn't need conspiracy theories to make it impressive. It needs the patience to understand how it actually worked. Well, and patience, unfortunately, doesn't trend on social media. The ocean doesn't care about algorithms. It rewards preparation, consistency, and respect for the process. Ancient Filipino sailors understood that. Maybe we should too.